my name is Stéphanie Gauttier. I am indeed a Marie Curie alumni. I am currently a professor, assistant professor of information systems at Grenoble Ecole de Management. And to give you a bit of background of why I'm talking here today, I enjoyed my doctoral studies to an extent that in a way I'm very happy that I'm still here today. But I also experienced some things that I thought should not exactly take place when we are being mentored as doctoral students. And I saw a lot of students in difficulty. So after I graduated, I started to think that there needs to be some movement for some change in the way we treat each other as future researchers or current researchers, to try to take better care of our mental health, and also ways in which maybe as researchers we can help each other. So at the Marie Curie Alumni Association, together with Dara, who is going to talk a bit later, we decided to implement a form of peer-to-peer mentoring system, which is part of the things that we're going to address. And then together with other people from the Marie Curie Alumni Association, Brian Cahill, who is here today, and Gabor Kishmirov, we set up a cost action that's called ReMO. It's the Researcher Mental Health Observatory. And we are starting, let's say, a movement to try to, at the same time, raise awareness on the problems that can be related to mental health in academia, and also, of course, try to figure out some solutions. And I can already see that some of you know ReMO quite well. I can notice some people who have been in our webinars before that. So that's a bit of, let's say, my background, and I will be chatting with you about well-being, doctoral studies, giving you a bit of evidence from the literature, but I'm also interested in learning, let's say, a little bit about you and who you are. So if you don't mind, I have prepared some questions for you. So I can put maybe the link, if I can retrieve. Here, it's on WooClap. It's supposed to work already. There's a couple of questions. We will do the WooClap a couple of times during the session, because I know it's online and I don't want you to fall asleep with me. So there's a first question there. Yeah, people are joining. I can see that you're there. So easy. I want to know, first of all, how you feel. We're going to talk about mental health. So let's try to get a sense. I'll give you like a minute to input your answers.
Are there any prizes, Stephanie, for the correct answer?
There is no correct answer, Dara.
Okay, just
checking. Okay. It's okay to feel blue. It's okay to be actually full of energy. Either works. It's also just a bit of a test question, making sure that the system works. You're not supposed to have to create an account. If you just go through the link, I can see already 20 people there. Yeah. When you're on the WooClap, please, if you can, do not close it, because we will use it afterwards. So then we can be a bit fluid again. I'll ask you 2 questions now in a row. Okay, I think I start to have most of you. Okay, so we have some people who are full of energy, so that's quite nice. I hope that you will maintain that energy level. Quite thankfully enough, we have, let's say, a majority of people who feel that they're okay. And unfortunately, we also have some people that may have some anxiety, some worries. Maybe some of you actually joined the webinar because you may experience, or you may see some other students who experience some issues around you. And it's perfectly okay. I cannot tell you that I'm exactly going to be able to solve your problems, or neither is Dara, I suppose. But we'll try to at least give you a sense of what's going on. And sometimes knowing that we're not alone with those issues is also already a little bit helpful. So I'm going to ask you a second question to try to actually understand that? Have you experienced any form of mental health issue? So for the moment, I take it in a broad way. It could be some form of depression, some form of chronic anxiety, chronic stress. Maybe you've seen some harassment in your research lab, anything like that. It's the same. I give you a bit of time to answer my question. I already have quite many answers. This is fully anonymous. I have no clue who is saying me what. I just know how many people tell me something. So don't worry about anything. And this is just for you and I. So those numbers, your answers are not going to go anywhere. That's right, Svetlana. It's a good point to make. So if I look at the answers that you're giving now, I think it's going to be helpful for all the speakers later on as well. We are actually a bunch of people who have experienced, so 56% of you tell me that they may have experienced something that's a bit of an issue in terms of mental health. And we also have quite many people who are saying they're not sure that what they have experienced can be called a mental health issue, which I think is an interesting way of looking at things, because sometimes, maybe we feel like something is going wrong, but we don't really want to label it as a mental health issue. Maybe we think it's not that serious. And basically today, what I would like to say first is that if it's an issue for you, what you have experienced, then it's okay to just say it. So we're going to go through this story of mental health issue. Sometimes you may just experience something that's let's say a loss of a lack of well-being. So there's many different ways in which we can look at that, and that's also going to be partially, I suppose, part of the conversation that we will have. So then, what is mental health? Now that we started to say we are not always sure, the WHO defines it as a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. Which means when we say we have mental health issue, that we are not able to actually realize everything we wanted to do. Maybe we don't react to stress in the way, let's say, we usually would do. We cannot manage it anymore. We're not so productive, and we cannot contribute to the community. So that's why I put depression, chronic stress, all these things. It's actually a sign that something maybe is not so good in terms of mental health. Another way to look at this definition would be to think that to actually have environments in which mental health is, let's say, a given, we need to make sure that we give people space to actually make the contributions they can and support them, let's say, in that way. Unfortunately, when we are doing research, it's not always the case. Mental health issues are actually much more widespread within the researcher population than it is in other populations. So we have numbers. I think those numbers are from the 2017 study of Katia Levesque. Anyway, they showed that there's 37% of researcher population that say that they have had mental health disorders. But if we look at the adult population overall, there it's only 19%. So we have double the risks. And then if you look at people who are at the beginning of their career, so typically PhD students, the numbers are even worse, because then, I will talk a bit slower, sorry, because then it's 50% of the PhD students that experience some form of psychological distress. So 1 out of 2, it means that whether you want it or not, either you have experienced it or you have probably been with people who have experienced some form of mental health issue. So we need to try to make sure first that we'll realize the extent, let's say, of the issue, because it means that we really have to do something about it. And we need to try to understand what could be the causes for this. And in those studies, they show that there seems to be a link with the way in which our work is being organized. It's not that, yes?
Sorry for interruption, but Could you please speak a bit slower?
Yes, I will try that. I'm sorry, I have a tendency to always speak fast, but I will try to go slower. So we could have thought, that maybe the numbers are so high because we as researchers, we could be some specific type of people. And maybe that would be already generally more at risk. Maybe people who choose to do research, have some personality traits or something, I don't know, that could lead them to that. Well, actually, what those studies are saying is that that's probably not the case. It's about the way in which we set up the work. So I think it's something that is quite interesting and powerful. So I have a new question for you, which would be, if that's the case, that we all experience some form of mental health issue, or 50% of the PhD students do, what do you think could be the reasons? So what are the reasons in your case? So on this question, you just have to type in, yeah, perfect. So I give you again a minute to do that. I will share with you later. I can already tell you that it's quite interesting. Okay. So you can keep your answers coming. I can already tell you that what's really coming up is about work. Having too much work, being overloaded with work is quite something. The pandemic also appears to be quite problematic for many people. The perfectionism, yes, this idea of, we want to try to do the best and publish maybe the best papers we can. And for that, we tend to overwork, or you fear to miss some deadlines. So we can see there is something with the pace of work. Some people, it comes also several times, are mentioning the need to anticipate. Sometimes it's hard to actually be able to manage maybe the research process and anticipate what's going to happen. But there is also a lot of pressure. There also seems to be sometimes issues with supervision, tutoring, and elements like that. Writing is also a very difficult task. Work life, that's also an interesting one. We're going to get back to it later. Imposter syndrome, yeah, that's also in a way one of the issues that you can experience. There seems to be a lack of support, or we don't know where to find it maybe, or it's not given to us also always in the way in which we need it. A lack of security. I hope it's a lack of security in a way of the professional maybe career, and not security physically in the space where you are. But it could also be possible. Hardships. There seems to be sometimes some financial difficulties, which depending on where we do our research, we may have a better or more difficult situation. So I think when I tell you these things, you may have already recognized part of your answers, but we see again that, we may be sometimes a bit perfectionist. Maybe we have some form of stress, but overall, the issue doesn't exactly seem to be with us, but more with the way in which we are working. Now, if I look at the literature, and it's a task that we started to do in the cost action, we can already identify some root causes for this poor mental health within researchers. We could try to divide them into the external element and the internal, let's say, more related to who you are as a person. As you can see on my slide, the causes that are external to yourself, they seem to be already more numerous. There is the supervision. So who is your supervisor? What do they do for you? There can be some elements that are from your personal life, but outside of you. So maybe you need to take care of a family member, and that's something that is going to put a strain on you. It could be the way in which your departments are structured and the financial opportunities, which are also elements that you have mentioned. I think it's quite important to realize that given the way in which the work is actually being set up, if you have to give informal care for another family member, it could be a parent, it could be a child, it could be a spouse, whatever, and you are doing a PhD, and you try to still have a form of private life, which is the case of a lot of us, then you are 55% more at risk of developing a psychiatric disorder, or let's say some form of mental health issue. Something that did not come up with us, but comes up in a lot of discussion is also the fact of being international. When you are not studying in your country, you are facing new difficulties. Language is one of them. The way of communicating also with your supervisor or with your peers can be different. That's a bit complicated. And now we have COVID, typically the pandemic, hitting on us, actually changing the way in which we work, changing the way in which we access the field, creating new forms of stress that we are not so sure how to handle, and which sometimes our institutions also don't know how to handle. And then sometimes there is something that is a little bit more related to ourselves, our motivations, our writing skills that you also mentioned in your answers, being able to understand and embrace our academic identity, and having a sense of self-worth, actually knowing that probably we will not get the Nobel Prize with our next paper, but still is good enough and is contributing to something. And all of those things, this motivation, the sense of self-worth, they are difficult to maintain when we don't have I would say a good work-life balance. I don't really like the term, but we need to be able to sleep. We need to be able to function. We need to be able to relate to the others if we want to be able to come and nurture that. So we already know all these things. That's what the literature is telling us, but I think it's important, especially if you are right now experiencing something that may make you feel blue, that you realize it's not just only you. Indeed, we could even go and look at other studies. This is a study published in Nature in 2019. And that study shows when we ask PhD students and postdocs that the biggest challenges for career and progression, it's not really something that comes from a desire to leave academia or lacking skills or something that we should do something about. It's more related to, again, external causes, the ways in which academia is set up, the competition for funding, for jobs, because there's not enough jobs available. The pandemic comes back in, the desire, in a way, to stay in academia is going to be impacted by that, and the fact that we are not able to maintain the personal time and the family time together with the job. So we need, again, that's something that I will say repeatedly, but I think it's really important. We need to understand that it's not only about our individual, let's say, manner of handling the job. We can see that in a lot of other surveys. So this is a screenshot from a study with a N-Square. That's a network of doctoral students in Germany. And they were, asking things about their students related to their anxiety levels and also the way in which they were working. And when you look at the results, it's quite interesting. You can see that there is high anxiety with people who actually do not feel free to take their days off, because the frequency at which we take holiday, of course, has an impact on the way we feel. But it's also the case with the frequency of weekend work and the amount of working hours. The more we work, the more anxious we tend to become. So we need a culture in academia where it is okay to actually go and take holidays. It is okay to rest. And of course, it's also okay to work hard, during the working day, because that's part of what we do, but we have a right to rest. The way work is set up, it's not only the way in which we structure, let's say, your working hours, it's also the type of contract that we give you. So again, N-Square has shown that if you are on a stipend or if you are on another type of contract, your anxiety level might be different, because if I have a contract where I contribute for an employment benefits or something, then I know that there is some form of safety caution. If I have a stipend and I don't, then of course, at the end of the stipend, it is a bit difficult. It can also be the rules within your institution. If your institution gives you clear guidelines of what you need in order to complete your PhD, usually you have less anxiety, because you know it's 3 papers, 2 conference papers, 1 journal paper, whatever it might be the case in your institution, but they need to give clear roadmaps. Sometimes institutions also enforce a policy of, you have to meet with your supervisor, let's say every 2 weeks. And generally, if you meet with them at that frequency, you have less anxiety because you have a form of continuous feedback. Whereas people who never see their supervisors, they may be more anxious because they're more isolated, which is also something that came back in your answers. Or whenever they see the supervisor, they need to have made huge progress. And if they did not, then they feel like they actually wasted time. So we need to make sure, maybe in doctoral schools, that there is a certain frequency in the meetings between the doctoral students and the supervisor. If you are young faculty like me, it could also be between you and your co-authors or your mentor or whatever. I'm always saying doctoral students because that's mostly where the data comes from, but it applies at any stage, obviously, of our careers in academia. And then another interesting point of N-Square was the idea of having a thesis committee that would be a couple of professors from other universities. And every year they say, well, that student made progress, we recommend that they continue, or maybe they give you some external feedback, which allows you to balance things out, especially if something is going wrong in a way with the supervisor. It exists in some countries, but it's not always implemented in the same way. But what's interesting is that they have shown in their reports that these things, they actually seem to be helping in lowering down, let's say, our mental health issues. All of those things, they very frequently relate back to the supervisor. I've already started to mention the supervisor a lot of times. So here, of course, there are also some elements, like we need to find someone with whom we can work, maybe 3, 4, or 5 years. The relationship is going to evolve. Sometimes it's a fit on the content, but not on the personality. Again, sometimes we don't meet them. Sometimes we have several supervisors and we lost. So we need to try to also account a little bit for this and put in place some elements, some barriers, maybe in institutions, in order to make sure that there will be the meetings and there will be enough, let's say, communication, or that you will be able maybe to find another expert to help you out in case you find that your current supervisor interests are not exactly yours. So we know about all of those elements. We know it, and still it's part of our culture to actually ignore all of those different elements. Because we said, like, we need to take holidays. You told me that you overwork, I also overwork. So if we look again at some of the nature data, we can see that there is usually in the respondents' answers a long hours culture at the university where they work, and they generally have a feeling that the university does not exactly support a good work-life balance. We tend to work on weekend and day offs quite a lot. And, I suppose depending on disciplines, you may end up spending some time overnight in a lab, and we work way more than what we are contracted. So that's kind of the norm. That's what we do. What I find really sad is that then, if you look at the answer to that question, would you recommend a career in scientific research to your younger self? There is less than half the people that say yes. So of course it's only 24 that say no, and some people say they don't know, but still, because maybe of the way in which we experience our own situations, we are not that sure that we would recommend ourselves to actually go for that. So some things in the system need to change. It's also a bit sad, and I don't want to discourage you, but obviously this doesn't stop at the stage of our doctoral studies. We will always have to publish more or keep publishing, we will also have other responsibilities. And so the pressure is there all around, which also makes me think that we need to try to take actions. So I have, I think, final question, not yet for you, which is, what do you think could help us to support researchers' mental health or your mental health, or what can we change? Now that we saw that this, let's say, environment and culture is not really helping us, what would you like to share as ideas? I see some answers coming in, so it's the same. I'm being silent to give you time to write, and I will share with you. Yeah, proper training. I see somebody's writing in the discussion. Yes, training. We can also discuss training on what. So there is an idea that's going around as well. That's about training people to supervise people, for instance. But it could be other forms of training. Training is actually the key word. It's the one for the moment that's like the biggest. So you need training. You also need support. Overall, you need something related to supervisors, mentoring, and there's people who have already put this idea of peer mentoring. I think you really want to be able to share. There is this idea of sharing, talking with others, and trying to have a culture of care, sharing, caring. The culture comes back again. Yeah, oh, that's an interesting one. Somebody is also talking about the reviewers. So I'm not sure in which sense, but indeed reviewers, be there for the PhD or for the papers that we write, they could actually probably play a role in the way we relate to our own work and the way we feel, especially by showing care and support. So that's mostly what comes. Some people are mentioning sports, other things that we can do. So trying to make sure that we have that. Family and friends, they are very important. Isolation doesn't play necessarily for us. Trying to do something that's about less uncertainty in careers. And there is also the idea of having less pressure to publish. So that's about the reward, let's say, mechanisms also in academia and the markets, which we will come back to. The support of the university, we will also discuss a little bit. Yeah, colleagues. So we need support systems. We need support systems, and we need things that are done, let's say, by institutions overall. Okay, I'll ask you a final question. That's the very last one. I want to know what you can do. What do you think you could do to help? If we need all of those trainings, the peer-to-peer system, the care, what do you think we can do at our own level? It's okay to say you don't know if you don't know. I will share with you the screenshots later. I just didn't share the screen, not to go through several screens at the same time, but it's quite interesting. So we have some answers that, I don't know, Brian, if you have the link towards the podcasts, but maybe the ReMO podcast could be interesting for people, because several of you are actually saying we need to raise awareness, we need to share our experiences, we need to actually know that it happens to everybody. The peer network, which Dara is going to explain what we've done for NCAA as well, peer support, lectures on the topic, trying to give tips. So all of those things are elements that we could try to do. So that's what also we try to do at ReMO. So you will be welcome to check the resources, but also see how maybe you want to contribute. We need to, and I think it's very important, we need to show support when somebody's rejected from something. So maybe we also need to figure out ways to act at our own, let's say, individual level, join organizations, resist some pressures, yes. And at the individual level, recreational activities, an exercise regime, something, resist, yes. So overall, you have elements that you could do for yourself, and you have elements where you think it's really important to try to raise awareness. Some of you start to mention that maybe we need to be a little bit politically active. And indeed, it is also some of the elements that I'm going to bring forward. If I look back to the literature is saying something that's quite obvious. It's saying, stop doing the things that are wrong. So if, there are some power imbalances, if people are bullying you, if somebody is a bad supervisor, then just engage with them or try to avoid that. But I think it's a little bit hard because, it's of course, it's partially about trying to reduce the strain from the supervisors, from the wrong setting in institutions. But this in itself does not necessarily address all of our issues, especially when it comes to work-life integration. Literature is also saying, let's try to start doing the things that seem to work. And things that seem to work is, having a sense of inclusion with your colleagues. So it's also some of the things that you are mentioning, and trying to focus on concrete achievements and intrinsic motivation. Because if I feel like I am progressing, I am accomplishing something, then maybe I will feel better in my own mental health. As individuals, there are indeed a lot of things that we can try to do to take care of ourselves, talking with the colleagues, this sense of achievement. Maybe we can even try to take some steps when we start our projects, our doctoral studies, or we move somewhere, to know about the system which we are going to join. Maybe we can have discussions to share the responsibilities between us and the supervisor, set up some routines, look for mentorship, all of those things that you and I have already started to mention. Overall, the overwhelming advice is actually that we need to be proactive, which again, you can do in many different ways. But sometimes I have a bit of an issue, let's say, with that, because we're putting a lot of burden on our shoulders that as doctoral students, as young researchers, we are supposed to have thought about all of those issues before we actually run into them. So if I look, at that list of advice before starting my PhD, I'm supposed to know what could go wrong. The truth is, when we start a PhD, we actually don't even know what exactly a PhD is going to be. So how can I actually take care of all of those things? It's a little bit of a lot to put on my shoulder. So maybe we need to think in a more systematic manner. Also, because if we keep on saying, it's about what you have to do, what you should know ahead of time, and the way in which you set things up, when things go wrong, then it becomes our own personal failure. But it's not, because we said that, it's part of the culture, it's part of the way in which we are asked to work. So it's not just about us, which I think is something that's important to me, that we all realize and share today. That's it's okay. Sometimes we have some difficulties in terms of mental health, and it happens to a lot of people, and it doesn't mean that you're not going to succeed, and it doesn't mean anything about you. It's just part of the situation in which you are, and we need to make sure, as a community, as your employer, as responsible, let's say, in a way, partially for the situation, to make sure that we help you to get out of that moment as soon as we can. Typically, this view is widespread, the view of, it's the PhD student or the researcher that has to do something. And I would imagine it's part of the reason. I don't want to say it's the only reason, but there is a lot of literature today about the issues of mental health that really look at the way in which researchers experience mental health issues, like individually. But there is not so much literature that addresses the issue from a more organizational standpoint or political standpoint. So we always come back to the individual as a unit, let's say, of analysis, and we try to focus on what they are doing. But again, it's not the only thing that we could have a look at. So it's also part of what we should do as a community, is to try to yield some evidence as to why, there could be some mental health issues in the same ways, the same type of surveys or other surveys, from the one from N Square that I showed earlier, or additional, let's say, research needs to be done in that direction. Something that we also need to say is that the research that has been done at the individual level, let's say for the moment, is actually quite powerful. If you and I are talking about mental health today, it's also partially, and thanks to the study of Katia Levesque of 2017, when they start to show that in their region, there is a strong issue with mental health for doctoral students. Because when you have numbers, it's actually easier to start a conversation. So we thank people for the individual level, let's say, research. We need more of that, but maybe we also need to try to adopt a little bit of another angle. We could start to think about, political responsibilities and what we can do about that. For us at ReMO, it's about trying to understand what it means to fund research. Sometimes you have research fundings that are for 3 years for a PhD student to write a thesis, when we all know that PhD students need at least 4 years, sometimes even 5, depends on the places and the disciplines to finish. So maybe we don't give them, let's say, the best chances to start with. Maybe it's about the development of the job market, trying to be able to monitor a little bit what is going on, trying to figure out how we can think of research careers sustainably, make sure that people can stay in academia, or maybe make sure that they know how to get into another path. That's also a possibility if we cannot increase the number of jobs. It's about revising the way in which we rate excellence, typically in research applications, but also at other levels, because that's what actually puts the pressure on us in many different ways, and so forth and so on. So there are things that can be done there that could have a direct impact on how we actually feel. But as I was saying earlier, individuals, they're asked mostly to reflect on their journey. They are also said, yeah, if you can't stay in academia, just try to do something else, but they're not necessarily well supported. When we are too broken to do that, we look for the external help. If we are lucky, our universities, they actually give us the support of counselors. I don't know how it is in your places. You would have to check. In many different countries, there are counseling services that are anonymous and usually for free for staff. But again, I can't exactly promise you that it's the case where you are, where you can go to have some information, which is quite nice, because at least you get the perspective of someone who is not exactly in academia, may also see what is rational or not so rational about it. You're going to be considered there as a full person, not only as a researcher, maybe in the way you could be when you're talking to other doctoral students, or when the supervisor is talking to you. And it's quite helpful if you need to prevent the development of further issues. Okay, so that's quite nice. At the same time, these people don't really understand it can happen exactly what we are going through, which is why we also want to put some perspective and shed some light on peer-to-peer mentoring, for instance, reference, which I'm not going to present because I'm going to to give the floor to Dara in a few minutes. What I would like to finish with is this idea that we have to reduce the stigma. So we can go and talk to someone if we have to. We can actually make some noise about the issues that we have. Because if we don't break that taboo, then the institutions are not going to do anything about it. If we don't break the taboo, then the policymakers are also not going to do anything about it. So we need to make the issue visible. And if you want to also be part of that, then we invite you to join us at ReMO. So ReMO is the cost action where we are actually working on all these things. We're trying to build an evidence hub that shows that the issue is prevalent. And we're looking at it from several perspectives, the individual one, the institutional level, the system level, the more policy level, if you want to, because all of those elements, they come together. And then we are trying to set up a training and dialogue network where we can share the best practices, where we can also maybe learn some skills in order to be able at our own level to cope better, but also to develop some form of institutional policies. And part of the solutions that we want to bring forward have actually been discussed a bit today, with the funding, with the training of the supervisors and so on. And we invite you to go and have a look at the researcher manifesto that we have written, where we explain some of the actions that we want to take. And again, you can sign up for the manifesto, which will help us to try to have more impact with it. And you can also get in touch for anything you would want to do, get support or participate in the action. Brian, if you have the link to the manifesto, maybe you can put it in the chat so it's easier for people to go and have a look at it. So that was it on my side. I thank you very much for your answers to my questions. I hope that this spectrum, let's say, gives you a bit of insight as to, the roots, the prevalence of the problem, and try to see potential solutions. I invite maybe you to, if there's questions, to put them in the chat. In the meanwhile, I will let Dara introduce referent and peer-to-peer mentoring, and we can anyway come back to your questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. I don't see any questions at the moment in the chat. People just continue saying thank you. So I also thank you once again. And Dara, please, you can start. And here is the manifesto link also posted by Brian. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Svetlana, and thank you, Stephanie, for such a comprehensive presentation. And I was taking notes with some of the responses to the questions, which is really, really interesting. I'm just going to share my screen with my slides. Can you hear me okay and see those slides okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Great.
We hear you well, and the slides are not in slideshow mode. Now it's fine.
Perfect. So I think Stephanie has told the story of researcher mental health perfectly, and I don't want to spend too much time going through the research and the policy stuff too much, but I'll just maybe give a highlight of some of the, I suppose, the key pieces of research and the journey that policymakers have gone on, that have inspired both Stephanie and myself to really pursue mentoring for mental health as a potential part solution to the many problems that we all know are out there. So with that, I'll just give a bit of an insight into the most recent research as of last year on the prevalence of these problems, and feed that into where we see the role of mentoring, how we define mentoring, and also what we've actually done in terms of the Reverent pilot project.
Dara?
Yes.
I see there is a comment in the chat that we see in the presenter view. For me,
okay.
It's fine, but could you please make it in a slideshow?
Slideshow. Oh, I think it says it's a slideshow in mine for some reason. Let me just exit that. Oh, it's perhaps on the wrong screen. Let me try this.
No, it's the
No.
same. You may stop sharing and share only the presentation itself.
I think I have the solution.
If you click on the next icon, the one that looks like reading a book.
Now
perfect.
perfect. Now
Perfect.
Now perfect. Yes.
It's not good for my mental health, all these technology problems. I swear I do lecture online sometimes as well. Thank you for the help. Feel free to interrupt if there's any issues. So yeah, I mean, just a bit about my own background. For what it's worth, I was involved with an EU project, an innovative training network based across Europe. So I'm quite familiar, and it's how I encountered the various working groups and the various organizations across the EU that are working on these issues. And I became very familiar with the common complaints, particularly hypermobility. A lot of EU projects, they say you must cross borders and collaborate and have impact, and there's lots of new expectations for early career researchers and academics. So I was working on a technology enabled mental health project. So there's a lot of crossover between these issues. I always ask the question, and I think Stephanie has probably asked a version of it as well. Why are we here? Why do we ask about mental health of researchers? Like, why not mental health of any other population? And it's always useful to ask yourself specifically why you are interested in that area for yourself, but also for others and the wider community. What we do know is that there does appear to be different risk factors. There is something unique about academia. We also know that, like most things in life, prevention is better than the cure. If we can learn more about the problem, we're in a better place to try and prevent it. We also know that positive mental health is another area. We often talk about, the bad things, and I think Stephanie was clear that, we don't want to get too depressed about these worrying statistics. We need to also think about what can work. So positive mental health and the literature around that is actually quite interesting. Very often when you ask researchers, particularly PhD students, when they start off and they've all these fantastic ambitions for academia, and then we see the reality of some of the struggles, whether it's the precarious nature of contracts, whether it's funding, whether it's the difficulty of writing, you often get a response like this. More seriously as well, we've also seen lots of media coverage. So not just the research, we've seen a lot come from social media, from traditional media, online media, outlining very serious and worrying problems, whether that's to do with tragic suicide cases, whether it's to do with massive dropout rates. And this has really caught the attention of the likes of the European Commission and large governmental organizations. And no doubt, I'm sure in your own region that you'll have encountered this type of coverage. As I said, I won't talk too much about the research. I just think it's really interesting from the responses that you gave in your questions. So there was some responses about feeling maybe there's too much work. There was some mention of writing difficulties, the lack of support systems. There was also an interesting point that Stephanie made about, do we think of our issue as being a problem, a clinical problem, or is this to be expected? And there's a lot of interest across particularly different disciplines and different regions as regards the question, is my mental health issue or challenge, is this at a clinical level or not? And the in-between with that is also quite interesting as well. Among some of the papers that I found really, really interesting are the ones you're seeing now. So some systematic reviews on PhD experiences. these are among the factors. So this is, it's really confirming what a lot of you have said. A lot of the things that can influence the overall well-being and sometimes the completion of PhDs are the factors that you've mentioned. So writing competencies, the motivation, your identity, who are you when you're a PhD student? Are you a researcher? Are you staff? Are you an educator? Are you an academic? What will happen after 2 or 3 years? There's lots of issues there, and who tells you who and what your identity is. Supervision, that's a massive one, which continually comes up in the literature, and we've all had a good supervisor or a bad supervisor, or a good teacher or a bad teacher in our lives. And another report here, which is from RAND Europe, this really speaks to the work-life balance and the high levels of work demands that many of you mentioned. They've identified that as being associated with the development of clinical levels of mental health issues. Stephanie also mentioned the seminal study from Katia Levesque and colleagues. So this was one of the first ones that really made policymakers actually listen and say, we have a problem here. 1 in 2 PhD students in the Belgian region experience clinical levels of psychological distress. And again, supervision and the leadership style and that identity issue, perception of yourself outside academia. These are really important factors in terms of predicting the actual mental health. So that's the research context. And the last one I'll give you was published at the end or mid last year. And again, this shows a high prevalence rate. So for clinical levels, by clinical I mean to the point where a clinical intervention would be needed. So not expected in normal everyday life. Clinical symptoms of depression was at 24% for a sample of, I think it was just over 15,000 PhD students. And clinical levels of anxiety were at 17%. So that's kind of the latest. Now, these are mainly US-based studies. The EU equivalent, we're trying to compile ourselves within the ReMO network. But this should give you a flavor as to how common it is. And as Stephanie also mentioned, even just knowing that can be quite powerful, to know that it's not an isolated experience that you are having. There are many, many other people across the academic hierarchy, not just PhD students. Many people are experiencing clinical levels and subclinical levels of these types of mental health issues. I will say something about the positive side of things. This is completely lacking in a lot of research, and certainly in the research area, but we often forget to ask what works, and there are many, sometimes it's the exact opposite as to what is causing the problems, but it's also worth reflecting on the absence of understanding what you might call protective factors. And Stephanie gives some suggestions as to what we think works, and it's true for many areas of life in terms of social interaction, support networks, work-life balance, physical activity. All of these things are important, but we actually don't know the specifics for a research environment as to what those positive protective factors are. Briefly about some policy, I mean, it's been quite clear across certain organizations, for example, the Marie Curie Alumni Association, that mental health has now been named as one of the key areas that they want to target in terms of addressing and building into kind of future research funding frameworks. I know some people mentioned in the questionnaire that it would be interesting to have reviewers and to have institutions, set a threshold for what they define as appropriate mental health supports. That would be a really interesting turn. So PhD students can know before they go into an institution that should there be mental health issues, that they will or will not have support. because we know, according to the OECD, that the stigma and the misperception about mental health issues is very different across different regions. And even the term mental health in some countries is itself stigmatizing. I know Katja Levesque was clear on the use of language in some recent interactions that we had with her, and she says, you know, sometimes work performance works better when you're interacting with policymakers rather than the term mental health, and there's many reasons for this. I touched upon some of the factors that are unique to early career researchers, and in the context of some of my experiences with the Marie Curie and the EU environment, some of the factors that were particularly noticeable were as follows. Hypermobility, so your funding is based on the fact that you must go to a different country, or go on sometimes at least two different secondments to different countries. Now, this brings with it a whole host of language, cultural, logistical, financial issues, not least, and that doesn't say anything about family and friend networks as well, particularly at a life stage when many emerging adults are of course, changing in their patterns of, be it personal relationships, family commitments, and so on. Competitiveness, the imposter syndrome, and the issues surrounding getting your funding means that we put a lot of pressure on ourselves as well. So from this, there's been a lot of recommendations to try and adjust some of those factors to try and make it less of a pressure and less of a risk factor for mental health. So all of that is a long way of saying, a long way of giving you the story as to why Reverend came about as one potential solution. Stephanie and I met through the MCAA, and we kind of got sick and tired of hearing all about the sad and depressing research and statistics, and we got bored of people from policy worlds giving promises and having great ideas, and then nothing happens. And I'm sure you will have all experienced this a lot, where we talk about mental health, we talk about what should be the case, we talk about what we can do, should do, will do, and then silence. So Reverend was born with that problem in mind. What can we do today and tomorrow to in some way support people that are struggling? Many of the things that we know from the psychological literature, particularly surrounding peer-to-peer support, suggest that a lot of the resources and strengths that we have are actually doing what we're doing right now, talking to each other, communicating about the very problems, not trying to give you a clinical intervention, not trying to fix the problem, but simply being there and talking about it is often the first step in addressing any problem in life. So it's that very basic holistic model of peer-to-peer support that underpins Reverend. So our kind of question was, well, could you have a peer-to-peer support specifically for researcher mental health? So I'll talk a bit about what we mean by mentor and mentee, and maybe talk you through some of the characteristics of each of those people, and how we went about our training, and maybe a brief update on how it worked. And it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts on it, particularly in the context of your access and their mentoring programs, and even just the whole concept of mentoring as one way to support the mental health of early career researchers. I hope I'm not talking too fast. Please let me know if I am. So what is a mentor? Or who is a mentor, rather? Simply put, it would be someone that is more experienced or more knowledgeable in a particular context, and they have a willingness to in some way share that wisdom in an unbiased way with their mentee. So this is the holistic, broad definition of a mentor. and we hear it in corporate environments a lot, for example. But for the purposes of Reverend, we adjusted this to be someone that also has experience with one or more of the following. So psychological difficulties in their early career, problematic work-life balances, or workplace harassment or bullying. So somebody that has experience of the academic world, but also self-identifies with one of those issues. Very often an issue in academia is not wanting to appear weak, not wanting to show your label to say that I experienced depression for 10 years in my lab and only now am I okay to talk about it. There's a lot of stigma surrounding when and where you can identify what's happened. So it's very powerful to have a mentor that is much more senior than you, but is also willing to share that they have had perhaps similar challenges to you. And it's a very nice starting point for a mentee. The types of characteristics that we were looking for when we were initially advertising our pilot program for Reverend was these types of characteristics. First of all, a good empathetic listener. So by empathetic, we mean just simply being able to be in the shoes of the mentee, not sympathy. There's a very important difference in a psychological sense between empathy versus sympathy. You need to feel heard as a mentee. We wanted them to be in some way networked within the MCAA, so to kind of know all the jargon, all the acronyms, to have a familiarity with some of the key issues that would face this particular network. And we also need a commitment to at least once every 6 weeks being able to have a meeting with their mentee, effective communicator, and very clear on the expectations. This is not an intervention. This is not a quick fix. This is something that is a very holistic and interpersonal kind of connection. So being clear on what the expectations are for the mentor and the mentee was crucial. And of course, being non-directive. So you can only ever be a guide or a sounding board. You can't be directive and say you should do this. We had hoped, of course, to have us as a real relationship, utilizing the many conferences in Europe to potentially meet up, as well as having it hybrid. But then, of course, a certain pandemic kicked in. We often get questions throughout training and various dissemination as to what it is and isn't, and often saying what it isn't is as important. It's not an intervention or quick fix, so it is not therapy. And you can often get prospective mentees thinking that this is therapy, or thinking that it is in some way meant to fix their issues. So that's why the training piece is so important for both parties. Nor should it be an emotional time or resource burden on either party, because it is voluntary, because it is peer-to-peer, in a non-hierarchical way. It's important that nobody feels burdened by it, that it genuinely is a connection where both people can get something from it. And of course, we have to be able to call out and understand where it might be directive or power driven, because of that kind of knowledge and experience gap. So these are all the things that we point out. Thinking about mentees, so it mirrors much of what we're looking for with the mentors, but a mentee has to be very clear on particularly the purpose, the potential benefits, but also the limitations of mentoring. And with that, a really important kind of thing that we look out for is the specificity of the aim. So how do you think a mentorship could help you? Is it with the view to simply being heard, simply having some interaction, or is it trying to find solutions? So it's really important to try and communicate to mentees that this is more of a space for mentorship rather than it being an intervention. We always need commitment and a receptiveness to the mentoring model, and of course willing to self-identify with one or more of these issues, so mental health, work-life balance, harassment or bullying, or even concerns about the risk of developing these into the future. Where are we at? So we've had 14 mentorships across the MCAA European network. Each of the mentors and mentees had separate webinar training where we went through each of these definitions, the kind of the model of mental health mentoring, and then we went through a process of matching in accordance with all of those characteristics. And then we simply let the mentorships take off, and largely online, or completely online actually, with 3, 6 and 9 month check-ins. This was a pilot, so there was no kind of inferential stats done on it, but we saw high engagement and satisfaction both with the format and the overall purpose of the mentorship. This was mainly attributable, I think we can say tentatively, because clear goals were established from the very beginning, and having those clear goals and having that kind of shared understanding was helpful for most of the participants. So we're delighted to start with a relaunch of the program, hopefully from February and March of this year. Both Stephanie and myself have been involved with Reverend MCAA and ReMO and various other projects, as well as our full-time academic careers. So it's been, as well as the pandemic. So we're looking forward to relaunching in a more systematic way, and hopefully with a larger sample. And we think this is a scalable bit part solution to doing something about the many issues that we've discussed today. The link is there if you're interested in learning more about the program, and you can of course contact myself or Stephanie if you're interested in learning more. I think I will stop there, because what's probably more interesting is a group interaction now. So I'll pass back to Svetlana, and I thank you all for listening.